Hey, welcome to the Awakening Report. I'm your host, Doug Hamp. Glad you could be with me. Tonight, we're going to do something pretty special. We're going to take some time and we're going to go through those 613 commandments. Whoa, 613 commandments. Now, wait a second. Who came up with that whole idea about 613 commandments? Well, it actually turns out that it first appeared in the Talmud that there were 613 commandments. Does the Bible specifically say that there are 613 commandments? No, it doesn't. Now, could there be? Well, I suppose there could be, but it all depends how you want to count those. And I want you to understand that it really comes down to one commandment, which is love. Love your neighbor, which is, of course, I guess there's two, right? Love your neighbor and, of course, love God. But even those two go back to one commandment, which is love. It's all about love. The commandments are about love. Think about it. When was the last time you drove through an intersection? Probably pretty recently. If you're an American, you probably drove through one pretty, not long ago, right? And when you're going through that green light, did it make you feel good that the other guy was required to stop? Did you even stop to think about it? Maybe you just kind of zoomed right on past that. Well, that's because there is something called law. And law is a good thing because we want to protect our neighbor. You know what's so amazing is that there are millions and millions of laws. Nobody can really add up how many laws we have here in the United States. And, as an American citizen, I go throughout my day, I don't even think much about the law. I don't think, oh, it's so burdensome and I wish I could get away from this law. It's so terrible. Most of the time, I'm thinking, I'm pretty glad that there are laws because it keeps me pretty safe. It helps me to know how to take care of my neighbor and my neighbor to take care of me. And when I go through that intersection, I don't have to worry that as long as we're all keeping the law, I can go through the green light. Now, if I break the law, if I run a red light, what I'm doing is by violating the law, I am putting myself in danger, the people in my car in danger, and the people coming from the other direction in danger, right? So law is actually very important, and law is all about loving your neighbor because the fact that I love my neighbor theoretically means that I really should stop when that light is nice and yellow, right? And then before it gets red, I really should come to a complete stop. I shouldn't just keep trying to make it, right? Now, maybe we've run a red light sometimes. Well, that's where there is grace, but I want you to know that accidents do happen. I remember when I was in high school, I was driving along, a couple friends in the car, and all of a sudden, bam, right out of nowhere, this guy hit me on the right side, ruined our car. And well, I wasn't at fault. I had the right of way. The light was green. But this guy, I guess he had been working too long and he was tired and he went through the red light. Well, it cost us a lot of money. Unfortunately, back in those days and with our situation, the car was a complete loss to us. And so we actually lost a lot of money. Thankfully, I and my friends were able to walk away from that accident without any serious issue. But when people break the law, then people get hurt. And that is why God has laws, because he wants us to be safe. He wants us to care for one another. And basically, he's given us the recipe. Now, let's get into the 613 laws, okay? Because this is where a lot of people have some pretty interesting questions about what that law actually is. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. So let's go ahead and we'll get started. We'll take a look here at something that I've prepared for this occasion. Now, this is, I've titled it the 613 commandments versus the law of Christ. I've got a question mark there because I'm not so sure that it really is this versus that. Now, before we get into that, I have just a series of drawings that I commissioned for this occasion. Now, here you see a guy. He is walking kind of toward a cliff, and you can see that there's some kind of sign. That sign is there to protect him. What does it say? Well, it says, hey, danger of falling. Violation of the law will result in death. In other words, if he goes beyond what the law is prescribing here, in other words, don't go over the cliff, avoid the edge, loose gravel ahead. These instructions, these laws, these commandments are here to protect him because somebody cared enough to put up warning signs on the ledge. Because if he violates, though, he has every amount of free will to violate these commandments. But if he does, he will get hurt. All right, so what happens? Well, he falls. Now, we don't know, how did he fall? Was he pushed? Did he get too close and the gravel let go? Or did he just plain jump? Well, either way, maybe it was a complete mistake. He really didn't want to get too close, or he was kind of close and there was some loose gravel and, oh no, he fell. Or maybe he was just kind of thinking, hey, you know what? I bet you I could get right up close to that thing and nothing's going to happen to me. He was kind of pushing his luck, so to speak. Or maybe he just decided to end the whole thing, right? Who knows? No matter how you look at it, whether it was a complete mistake, it was an honest accident, or he was kind of pushing his luck, or he just plain jumped, it doesn't really matter because now the law has been violated and he's on his way down, presumably to his death. Okay, there's really nothing that he can do at this point to save himself. Now that he's violated the law, there's nothing that can happen to turn that around. The only thing that could happen would be a miracle, and that would be where God stretches out his hand and catches people. Now, the people that I would suppose God would catch would be the ones that said, you know what, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean to jump. It was a complete accident. Or the guy that says, you know what, I was a fool. I got so close to the edge and I thought I could walk right next to it. But then, you know what, I fell. And, the guy that jumped off because he wanted to, he probably doesn't want to be caught. So he's probably not going to ask for any mercy or grace. But the people that didn't mean to violate it, they are going to ask for the grace. Okay, and so you can see there God's big hand stretched out and is catching people. Now that's a complete act of grace because they didn't deserve it. They were warned, but they didn't do the right thing. They didn't heed the warning that God gave in his instructions. And so then what is God going to do? Well, he's going to put the person right back up on top of the ledge. Now, what do you suppose that person should do? Do you think that person should take more or pay more attention to the law? Should that person say, you know what? The last time this happened, I fell, and it was only by grace that I got put back up again. I don't want to break that law again. Well, I think that's what a wise person would do. Now, is it possible that that person could fall again? Well, I guess it's possible, right? Anything is possible. But if the person is at all wise, and if the person has repented, has changed from his former conduct, then he's going to do everything in his power to stay away from the ledge. He's not going to, not watch where he's going. He's not going to get up close and push his luck, right? He's going to say, you know what, I was saved by God's miraculous hand. I want to be careful because I don't want to have to call on God to save me again. Now, if the guy falls again, do you think God would save him? Well, probably. God seems to be in the business of doing that. But after a while, you have to say, well, wait a second, buddy. You keep falling off this thing. This looks like it's becoming intentional. Do you want to just fall? Do you want to keep jumping? Or why are you doing this? Why do you keep getting right up to the edge and then falling and then expecting me to carry you and to catch you? All right, now look, I don't know how many times God is willing to catch somebody. That's not my prerogative to say that. But all I know is that it's my job, and I believe it's your job, to stay away from the edge. And God has given us those warning signs. And that's essentially what we have in the law. Now, the next thing to understand is that the laws are things that were given by God himself, not by Moses. Moses didn't give us any of the laws. Moses was simply a secretary. And you have a medical transcriptionist. The letter was typed out by that transcriptionist. The letter was put onto paper or in the computer, as it were, by that secretary. But he or she was not the author of that letter. It was the doctor who was the author of the letter. And that's the same thing that we have, is that Moses is simply the secretary. All right, that was a pretty good position, but he was only the secretary. He was not the originator of that. Now again, it was the Talmud, Tractate Maktot 23b, that tells us that there are 613 commandments, 248 positive commandments, the do's, and the 365, according to the days of the year, of course, negative commandments, those are the do nots. Now, it was the Talmud, of course, doesn't tell us or doesn't give us a complete list of those commandments. And so there have been several Jewish scholars over the years that have compiled a complete listing of these commandments. And though they agree on the majority of the commandments, they don't. They do agree. Excuse me. Though they agree on the vast majority, they do disagree concerning a number of them. So the arguments are for a scholastic purpose only, for they do not disagree over any actual commandment, whether it is mandatory or forbidden. They only disagree whether certain commandments are independent commandments or perhaps they are part of another commandment and are not counted on their own. So the following list that I'm going to share with you it follows the opinion of Maimonides as he lists them in his magnum opus, the Mishneh Torah. It must be noted that many of these commandments, such as all the commandments associated with sacrifices, are not practical as long as there is no temple in Jerusalem. And this is from Aish.com. Now, I am not necessarily endorsing the 613. And I think what we're going to see, what I want to show you, is that this list of 613, many of these I think that you'll already agree with. But I want you to see that many of these are also very redundant. In other words, the 613 was a number that was put out there by some people in the Talmud, and then they had to kind of compile the list in order to come up with that. This is not something that we find in the Bible. This is not a number that God has inspired. This is not a number that Jesus has authenticated. And it's not a number that any of the disciples or any of the prophets even allude to. The number 613 is a number that was invented by the rabbis. Okay, so just understand that. I'm not saying that we have to follow 613 laws, but I do believe that you will see that most of these are pretty practical, and there's really nothing that we probably would disagree with very strongly. But what I've done is I've actually gone ahead and I've color-coded a lot of these. Not all of them, but many of them. Okay, so if there's no color, I'm presupposing that we already agree with them. And then if I put them in green, it means that we strongly do agree, and we definitely should. So, okay, no color or green means basically the same thing, okay? Green is just there for a little bit more emphasis. If it's in yellow, then that means that we should check the actual verse, because sometimes we're going to see that this list that was invented, it's making a suggestion about the law, but it doesn't actually say that in the Bible. God did not actually say, in my opinion, the Bible does not actually say what the rabbis are suggesting. Okay, so we'll take a look at those. And then when it's in red, I believe that the rabbinic interpretation is incorrect in relation to the stated commandment as given by God. Okay, so again, you have to understand this list of 613 is not given directly by God. This list of 613 is a list that has been more or less invented from the Bible in large part, but not completely. All right, and that is why it's so important that we take a look at that. And then things that I put in purple, I believe that they were once practical, but they're not currently without a temple. All right, so that's the thing to understand. And you have to understand that Jesus himself did not keep all the laws because he did not fit into every category. He's not a woman, so obviously laws that pertain to women, Jesus could not do. Jesus was not a Levite, so therefore the laws concerning the Levites would not apply to Jesus. All right, and the list goes on. He wasn't a farmer, etc. So there were many laws that did not apply to him directly, even though they were good laws and God gave them, but he himself could not keep those. Just like today, here in America, there are millions of laws, but most of them don't really affect me because I'm not of this and I'm not of that. I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't have to really be concerned with the medical or malpractice laws. I'm not a contractor, so I don't have to think about construction laws, etc. I'm sort of aware of them. I know that some of these laws exist, but they don't affect me on a day-to-day basis. That's what I'm trying to get at. So let's take a look here at this list to really understand. And I think, again, once you see it, you're going to be like, oh, all right, let's get started. Well, the first one, to know there is a God. Well, that's a pretty good commandment. I mean, God does say, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me, right? So the first thing he says is that yes, I am your God. And so what they've done, okay, again, this is the rabbis speaking, is to know that there is a God. Well, I would basically agree with that. I mean, I would agree with that. The first commandment, and that's what God stated, is to know that he is the God. All right, and then it goes on, not to entertain thoughts of other gods besides him. Well, that makes sense. That's what God said in Exodus 20, verse 3. All right, and then the third commandment that they have listed here in this list of 613 laws, to know that he is one. Deuteronomy 6:4. When Jesus was asked, Rabbi, what is the greatest of all the commandments? Well, he responded directly with Deuteronomy 6:4. He said, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Oh, he might have said Yehovah, but that's okay. We'll do that in another segment. So he said, no, he says, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Okay, and so that's what he said. And then he followed up with to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, your soul, and your strength. That's what he said. All right, that's what Jesus himself said. So again, we agree with this. And then Deuteronomy 10:20, to fear him. Hey, that makes sense. To sanctify his name. Well, that makes sense. To not profane his name. Well, I agree with that. I agree with every one of these things. Okay. Now, the next one, number 8, says not to destroy objects associated with his name. I read that, I'm like, I really got to check that one out. So what does the text actually say? Deuteronomy 12:4. It says, and you shall destroy their altars. So God, or here, of course, Moses is, of course, relaying the law that God gave, but he says that you shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, and burn their wooden images with fire. You shall cut down the carved images of their gods and destroy their names from that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God with such things. Okay, so that's what it actually says. So says to not destroy objects associated with God's name. Well, in my opinion, the text doesn't quite say that. Is it a big deal? Well, I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. But here's an example of where they've gone through, the rabbis have gone through the text, and they have simply listed them for us in an order that made sense to them. But the principle here, I definitely agree with. All right. So God told the Israelites, and had I been there, I would have done the same thing. Now, I don't see sacred pillars today. I don't see wooden images. But if I should come across those kind of things, then I probably should do what God says to do and destroy those altars. Okay. Um, so, that's something that we should think about, especially there being in the land of Israel. All right, now, it says to listen to the prophet speaking in his name. Well, aren't we supposed to speak to the prophet speaking in God's name? Well, most certainly we should do that. There's no question about that. All right, number 10. Well, here again, I had a question. It says not to test the prophet unduly. Well, it says don't test the Lord your God like you tried him in Massah. So I didn't see that the text actually says what they have on their list in regards to this prophet. Basically, God says, hey, don't test me like you did back in Massah. All right. Now, I agree that we should not test God like the Israelites did back in Massah, but the text doesn't specifically say what they're saying. All right, let's keep going. Number 11, to emulate his ways. All right. To cleave to those who know him. Okay. To love other Jews. Leviticus 19:18. Well, okay. I mean, yes, there's no question about that. What it actually says is to love your neighbor as yourself. So, I'll give them a little bit of credit here. They've kind of said the Jews when it says your neighbor. All right, it's close enough. So I had a question about that one. I would give them kind of half a point. That would be kind of me. All right, to love the converts. Well, what does it say? You are to love the foreigner because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. Now, it's interesting. The word here, the foreigner, is the word ger, and it's referring to somebody who is a foreigner, who's of foreign nationality, but he's now living in Israel, and he's going to stay for quite a long time. All right, so he's not just passing through. He's not just kind of walking through the land he's about to leave. This is somebody who's kind of a transplant. You might call him an expat, all right? And God is saying you should love the foreigner. And so presumably they're probably some kind of convert. Now they've kind of reduced this here, but you know what? I'll have to agree with that. You should love the convert. All right, well, not to help hate fellow Jews. Well, the text doesn't quite say that. It says you are not to hate your relative in your heart, rebuke your neighbor if you must, but you are not to incur guilt on account of him. And then it says you should love your neighbor as yourself. So it's not just the Jewish people, but it's that you are to love your relatives and you're not to hate your relative in your heart. All right, pretty close. All right, to not reprove wrongdoers. Now look what just happened here. We have one verse, all right, as we have versified these. So we have one verse, but now we have a couple different commandments. Look at that, numbers 15, 16, 17. And then if we kind of go down a little bit, we see that here we have Leviticus 19:18, 19:18. And if we go back up, here we had it again, Leviticus 19:18. So look what they're doing. They're pulling out 6 commandments from 2 verses. You see that? So the 613, it's because they're taking it bit by bit by bit. But look, just because we don't take it bit by bit by bit doesn't mean that we think that we shouldn't keep these things. Of course we do. We think that we should keep these. I claim at least, to believe everything that God says. And so I want to do what God has told me to do. And though I may not have broken it down, the verse into 3 different commandments, and 2 verses into 6 commandments, but that's how the rabbis did it. So again, the 613, it's a little bit of a misnomer. It's a little bit of a misnomer, okay? So again, let's look at that actual commandment. You're not to hate your relative in your heart, rebuke your neighbor if you must, but you are not to incur guilt on account of him. So what they have then is not to hate fellow Jews or your neighbor, to reprove wrongdoers, okay, rebuke your neighbor if you must, there it is, not to embarrass others, but you're not to incur guilt on him, okay? So again, what the rabbis have done is they've taken this one verse and they've now kind of divided it so we can see it a little bit better. Again, I think that is okay because it's helping us to really think about it, to meditate on what the word actually says. Remember, these are from God. These are not Moses' instructions. These are God's instructions relayed by the agent, Moses. Moses is simply the agent. He's not the one that actually gave them, but it was God himself. All right, let's go on. Not to oppress the weak. Hey, I'm all for that. Not to gossip about others. Well, I have to agree with that one as well. Let's take a look at that one. All right, it says you're not to go around slandering your people. You're not to stand idle when your neighbor's life is at stake. I am the Lord. All right, now hopefully this is all, you can see what I'm seeing here. And so again, do you agree with that? Well, I agree with that one. Again, you're not to go around slandering. I think that makes perfect sense. So yes, we have to agree with that. There's no way that you can say, oh, I think that commandment should be done away with. I think not gossiping is still the way we ought to do things. Do not gossip. All right. Then we have another one. Do not take revenge. Do not bear a grudge. Again, this is from the same verse. All right, so there it is. Well, let's take the next one, Deuteronomy 6:7. To learn Torah and to teach it. Well, again, what does the text actually say? Does it actually say that? Well, the word Torah just means instructions. So yes, we are to learn Torah. We are to learn Torah. We are to learn God's instructions, and then we should teach others about God's instructions. Again, this is God of the universe, the God who spoke the worlds into existence, the God, the Father of the Lord Jesus Christ. Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I and the Father are one. No matter how we want to slice and dice that in relation to the hypostatic union, the 3-in-1, the triunity, and all that stuff, it really doesn't matter. If you really believe that Jesus is God, then Jesus gave these commandments. Jesus is the author of these commandments. And so far, I haven't seen a single one that is so hard and oppressive to keep, right? And yet that is what the enemy wants us to believe, is that these are so difficult. Nobody could do these things. Look, you guys, you can do these things. Does it mean you'll do it, 110% every day? I don't know. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. If you blow it, ask God to forgive you and get right back on track, and he will be with you. But don't use an excuse to say, well, I can't do it. Nobody can do it. Well, that's not what God seemed to think. He talked about Daniel. He talked about Job. He talked about Noah. He said that they were righteous in their generation. He talks also about Elizabeth and um, Zechariah, the parents of John the Baptist, right? They were righteous, he says. Okay, so it is possible, but we're not using this list here. This is not a checklist that says, well, if I just do these things, then I'll be right with God. No, of course not. That doesn't make any sense. It's not a checklist that you keep so that God will then let you into heaven. That's ridiculous. All right, let's imagine that you're in love with a pretty girl, okay, and you want to win her hand. Now, you learn some things about her, right? You've kind of become friends, and you know that there are 5 things that she just loves, and there's 5 things she just hates. So you write these down, okay? You're kind of studious, right? You write these things down. And then you think, okay, if I just do the list, then she'll fall in love with me. Right? And so there's 5 things that you never do. All right. Well, that's good. I'm sure she's happy about that. And then there's 5 things you do. You buy her flowers every day. Well, that's pretty good, huh? You get her ice cream, right? And the list goes on. Now, she might fall in love with you because of those things. She might not. But it's not the list. It's not doing the list. Now, if you continue to develop your relationship with her and your friendship with her, and you do the things on the list, I'm sure she's going to be really happy. Now, let's say that you guys get married, it's all great, and you're like, you know what, I don't need the list anymore. It's all good. And so then you're like, you know what, the list doesn't matter, okay? And so then you start doing the things that she hates, and you stop doing the things that she loves. And she's like, well, wait a second, what happened? Before you were doing these things, now you don't do these things. You say, well, we're married, I don't have to keep the list anymore. But it was never about the list. You see, this list here is a guideline. It helps you just understand what we're talking about, what God is about. But it's not a checklist. Well, if I do these different things, if I keep all these different laws, then God has to love me. You're missing the point. Now, does that mean when you come to Christ that you should no longer keep the list? Well, no. But it's not about keeping the list that wins you over with God. But certainly God is going to like it if you do keep the list, right? He's going to appreciate that because he gave the list. Those are the things that he likes and doesn't like. But it's not keeping the list that earns your salvation, not at all, or earns that relationship with you. All right, let's keep going through this list. I want to go through it quickly. There's a lot to get through. I really want to take you through so you can have an appreciation and an understanding of what it's all about. Because I think probably for most people, they've never actually had a close look at what it actually says. So let's take some time and let's go through these. If you need to, after this show is done, go back, look at the replay, play it again and look at the list, okay? We may not get through all of these, but we'll get through a lot of them. All right, so we're to teach and know Torah. We're not to inquire into idolatry. Well, that makes sense. We're not to follow the whims of your heart or what your eyes see. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, I agree with that. We're told that the heart is, deceit is desperately wicked and deceitful. Who can know it, right? So right. We should do what God says and not just, well, I just feel like doing this today. We should be careful not to blaspheme. Well, that makes sense, right? Now, again, I didn't color code these for you, but these are things that I believe that we should agree with. Not to worship idols in the manner they are worshipped, certainly. All right, not to bow down to idols. Again, I agree. Not to make an idol for yourself. I agree. Not to make an idol for others. I agree. Not to make human forms even for decorative purposes. Okay, that seems to be what it says. Not to turn a city to idolatry. I agree. City that has turned to idol worship. So this law is still good, but it's rather impractical for Americans. Certainly, God said this in specific relation to those who were already in the land of Israel. Now, whether or not we should burn cities for people that are worshiping idolatry, I don't know if we should burn them, but we should at least do something to help them get to understand what is happening. Because here's the reality. If idolatry continues to happen in America or any country, that country will pay the price. Okay, but again, this is a little bit impractical here for us Americans. Does that mean that it's not a good law? Good law? No, it's still a good commandment. It's still a very good commandment. It's still a true commandment. Should we keep this? Well, in the sense that that here they were in the land of Israel. This may not be something that we can do as Americans, but we may be able to work and legislate and help to win the hearts of people so that they don't want to turn to idolatry instead. All right, not to rebuild it as a city. All right, not to derive benefit from it. Okay. Now here's some that we have to take a look at. Not to missionize an individual to idol worship, and not to love the missionary, that is to worship idols. Now, you have to understand that this list was made somewhat in reaction to Christian missionaries. And so the idea of a missionary, somebody who's coming to tell them to follow Jesus, all right? Now, the reason that they did this is because the average Jew believes that Jesus is a false god. All right, so from their perspective, if Jesus were a false god, which I don't think he is, then of course this would make sense. Don't listen to the missionary. He's trying to get you to worship a false god. So, but that's not actually what the text says. All right, that's what we have to understand. The text says to watch out for those prophets who would try to get you to worship God in a different way. And since we can prove and demonstrate clearly from Scripture that Jesus is the promised Messiah, then this would not be true for us today. But in principle, we certainly agree with this, that we're not to listen to the false prophets who would try to get us to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in a way that he did not prescribe. That is what the text actually says. All right, let's keep moving. Not to prophesy in the name of idolatry, not to listen to a false prophet. Again, I agree. Not to prophesy falsely in the name of God. I agree. Not to be afraid of killing the false prophet. Well, that's interesting. Okay, first of all, you have to understand what is a false prophet. Okay, and it's not mob style rule. We don't just go out there and take a gun and shoot some guy. Right? You're a false prophet. Everybody was to be given a fair trial. Everyone had their day in court. They were judged by the city council. And then those who were witness to his false prophecies would be the first to cast a stone. So we have to understand what is actually happening there. But is it still a good law? Absolutely, because when false prophets come around and they tell us things that are not true, we all suffer if we believe them. All right, not to swear in the name of an idol. Again, I agree. Not to perform oath or mediums. In other words, don't visit psychics and such. All right, I agree with that. Not to perform Yidoni, that's a magical seer. Not to pass your children through the fire to Moloch. My goodness, I sure hope we agree with this one. Basically, it means you're not supposed to burn your kids. I think that's a really good law. I still completely agree with this. And when you start looking at things like abortion, where they're basically burning or dismembering the children inside the womb, that is an awful thing. And I believe that America is going to pay the price. We're going to be judged because of our sins, because we have been practicing this very thing that God said not to do. So this is a law that is still standing. Now here's a law: not to erect a column in a public place of worship. That's an Asherah pole. All right. Now, there's some debate what that exactly looked like. There's discussions out there that I don't want to get into at the moment, but still, this is a very, very good law, and I completely endorse it. Now, here's one, not to bow down on smooth stone. Well, what does the text actually say? Does it say not to bow down on smooth stones? It says you're not to make yourself worthless idols, images, or pillars for yourselves, nor set up for yourselves carved images to bow down to them in the land, because I am the Lord your God. So where the rabbis understood smooth stone, I'm not exactly sure, but the law itself is still a good thing because it makes sense that we're not to bow down to other gods, to worthless idols, images, or pillars for yourselves, nor set up for yourselves carved images to bow down to them. So that is still a good and effective law. I think we would all agree that we're not supposed to bow down. As Christians, we're not supposed to bow down to any law, any other gods, or any false idols, or false gods, as it were. Not to plant a tree in the temple courtyard. Now, what does it actually say? You shall not plant for yourself any tree as a wooden image near the altar which you build for yourself to the Lord your God. Well, that's still a good law, but here's the reality. We don't have a temple, so here's a law that's still good. If there were a temple, we would still practice it, but we don't have a temple. Now, does this mean that this law has been abolished? Well, no, it just means that it's inoperative. Okay, there's a big difference. There's something that can be inoperative. In other words, it is not operatable at the moment, versus it's been abolished. Okay, in other words, if it were abolished, if there were still a temple, then that means you could plant a tree near the altar. That would be abolished, but it's not abolished. Just the trouble is, or the issue is, that there is no temple. Therefore, it's impossible to act upon this law in any way, for or against. It's impossible to do anything with that without the temple. So again, this law is simply inoperable. To destroy idols and their accessories, I agree with that. Not to derive benefit from idols and their accessories, I agree with that. Not how you seeing a trend here. A lot of these are basically saying the same thing. Okay, they're basically saying the same thing, but they're enumerating them one by one by one, and there's a lot of repeat. Okay, so that is really what's happening here. So again, the 613 is really a lot of a misnomer. They're kind of are, if you really break them down like this. But it's not something that you have to be so concerned. My, there's 613. There's millions in America, but these supposed 613 is just too much to handle. And yet, when you really break it down, it's not that much. All right, not to be superstitious. Well, that's a good law. All right, not to go into a trance to foresee events. All right, that's still a good law. What does it actually say? There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, or one who practices witchcraft, or a soothsayer, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. I still agree with that. I hope you agree with me that that is still a good law. That is a law against gross evil. That is something that should not happen, and yet we allow these things to happen in our country, and we pay the price when these things happen. This is when these kind of people are in our society, then children go missing, children end up dead, children end up raped, abused, violated, murdered. No matter how you want to spell it out, that is what happens. Happen when we allow these kind of people to remain in our society. We pay the price for not acting upon the law. That is the reality. Here's some more. Not to engage in astrology. I agree. Not to mutter incantations. I agree. Not to attempt to engage the dead in conversation. I completely agree. Not to consult the Ove, that's the mediums or the psychics. Not to consult the Udoni. Now, we already had this, didn't we? All right, so there it is again. We're seeing this again. Okay, here, let's get to this one. This is kind of fun. Number 68, men must not shave the hair off the sides of their heads. All right, what does it say? What does it actually say in the text? First of all, it's talking about doing that, shaving off the sides of your hair for the sake of the dead. And one that goes right along with it, men must not shave their beards with a razor. All right, well, again, we have to go back and look at the actual text. Here's what it says. You shall not eat anything with blood, nor shall you practice divination or soothsaying. You shall not shave around the sides of your head, nor shall you disfigure the edges of your beard. And in the Hebrew it says, and you shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks on you. I am the Lord. Do not prostitute your daughter to cause her to be a harlot, lest the land fall into harlotry and the land become full of wickedness. And let's go on, there's a few more. You are the children of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves, nor shave the front of your head for the dead. See that right there? For the dead. Okay, speaking about priests. Now again, as a non-priest, this is something that doesn't really concern me because I'm not a priest. But even if I were a priest, the reason that they're not supposed to shave is they're not to defile themselves for the dead, except his relatives who are nearest him. Okay, so in other words, somebody dies and you shave off your head. Well, God's saying, don't do that. Don't do that. That's not what you're supposed to do, unless it's somebody who's really close to your mother, father, son, daughter, brother, virgin sister who's near him. Okay, then he can defile himself or he can cut off his hair, right? So he's not to do that. And he also says, they shall not make any bald place on their heads, nor shall they have shave the edges of their beards, nor make any cuttings on the flesh. Now, it's ironic that some of the monks, the holy men of the church, what do? They put a bowl on top of their head and they cut around it so that they would show that they are of a special class. And God says specifically, don't do that. Now, he's not saying that you can't have a clean shaven face. He's not saying that. What he's saying is don't do it on behalf of the dead. Right here. Don't shave the front of your head for the dead. I can't really add to that, okay? Don't do it for the dead. All right. So the reason that people would cut off their hair or their beard was in mourning or in some kind of ritual for the dead, as it were, some kind of a medium or spiritist or some kind of an evil type of thing. And he says you're not supposed to do that. And notice that it goes right along with don't eat blood, don't practice divination, soothsaying, and then he goes right on. You shall not shave around the sides of your head, nor shall you disfigure the edges of your beard, and you shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead. So this all goes together, and I highlighted the word and in here for you to show you that this is talking about all the same thing. It's a kind of a sandwich here, if you will. Blood, divination, soothsaying, don't cut your beard for behalf of the dead. All right, that is what God is trying to get at. It's not just saying you got to have a beard. Look at, guys, there's some people in the world that can't even grow a beard. So what, are they somehow in violation of God's commandment? No, of course not. Of course not. I am sorry to say that there are some people in Christianity who think that these commandments that God gave are awful and they're burdensome and they're terrible, and we're so glad that Jesus died to set us free from this horrible, God-forsaken list. But that's not even close to what God is saying. All right, let's go on. Men must not wear women's clothing. Oh no, does this mean that women must not wear men's clothing? Well, they can't wear pants. Okay, well, wait a second. Pants didn't come around for a very long time. They came around about in the 1400s, roughly 1300s, you might say, somewhere in there. They were called the pantaloon. It's from Arabic, and they eventually became pants. But way back in the days of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Jesus, all right, nobody was wearing pants. They were all wearing a gown. They were wearing a robe. But there was a robe that was designed for a man, and it had a manly, masculine look to it. And then there was one that was designed for a woman, and she wore it in a very feminine way. Right? So you could just take that simple robe, and then you could turn it around. You could make it look like, even though you're a guy and it's a robe and the woman's wearing a robe, but you could dress yourself in such a way that you would be looking like a woman. So it's not about whether you wear pants or don't wear pants or suits or something like that. He's not saying that. He's saying, men's clothing should be for men and women's clothing should be for women. Doesn't mean women can't wear pants. I mean, that's an idea that I don't know who came up with that, but that is not what the Bible is saying. It's not what the Bible said. All right, not to tattoo the skin. This is in relation to the dead. Not to tear the skin in mourning. Again, I think that's a pretty good commandment. Not to make a bald spot in mourning, to repent and confess wrongdoings. I'm all for these things, okay? Now here's one that you're supposed to say the Shema twice daily. Again, when Jesus was asked, what is the greatest of all the commandments? He said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So he said that specifically. Now, whether or not you're supposed to say Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, if you have to say that particular thing twice a day, well, that's up for debate, because what it actually says in Deuteronomy 6:7 is that you shall do it when you rise up and when you sit down. Okay, so maybe that's a good practice. Maybe we should adopt that. It's very possible. But I think the spirit of the law here versus the letter, but the spirit of the law is to teach your children about God all the time. That's would be my interpretation. Is that you're to teach your children and to remember God all the time. All right, do it all the time. I think that's really what the spirit of that law is trying to say. It's not just a formula. So, well, I did it in the morning, I did it at night, so therefore I'm okay. It's not that way, you guys. This is what God's saying. This is what I want you to do, to be teaching your children all the time. Doesn't matter where you are. You're in the car. You're going to the next activity. You're sitting around the table. You're in the drive-through. You're talking about me. That's what I want you to do, and teach your children. That's the point. Well, to serve the Almighty with daily prayer. Well, that sounds pretty good. What does the text actually say? It says, you are to serve the Lord your God, and he will bless you with food, water, and I'll remove sickness from you. So, it doesn't say to serve him with daily prayer specifically, but it does say that you are to serve God and that you are to pray to him, and he will bless you with food and water. So, okay, that one's pretty good. All right. Now it says the Kohanim must bless the Jewish nation daily. Well, we don't have Kohanim, but we are told to be those priests. So we should bless one another. We should bless our nation. We should literally say blessings over each other. Okay, now here's a good one. Here's is interesting. It says to wear tefillin on the head. All right, so the question here, is this interpretive, or is it, is this something we're supposed to physically put on our head, or does this mean that we're supposed to have God's word in front of us? My take would be that we're supposed to have God's word in front of us. He says that you're supposed to tie them on as reminders on your forearm, bind them on your forehead. All right, now, so, maybe we're supposed to do that. Maybe I'm missing the boat here. But what I understand, and what I would suggest is the spirit of this law, which is a good law, one that we should keep. But I think the spirit of this is that we are to constantly have God's word in front of us. We're supposed to be thinking about it. It should be at the front of our mind. It should be on the front of our mind. Now, maybe you need to wrap something around your arm to remember that. Well, I guess that's possible. My thinking is, why don't you read the Bible? But again, the idea here is that you're supposed to have this on at all times. Now, also understand the tefillin, all right, the tefillin, you have a little block that you put on your head and a piece of leather that you put around your arm. That's what they do today. That's what the ultra-Orthodox Jew will do today. But there is good evidence. The tefillin, it just comes from the word to pray, okay? So it's something you're supposed to use in your prayers. And so you could also have been some kind of a bandana, a handkerchief, if you will, something you'd put around your head. You do that anyway. When you're out working and you're sweating, you'd put something around your head. And even that was supposed to be sanctified. Even that was supposed to be a reminder of who God is. God wanted us to remember his commandments because they lead to life. And then to put a mezuzah on each doorpost, okay, well, I think that's a great idea. You actually have a little scroll of the Bible and you put that on your door. For one, it lets people know who you are, that you believe in God. For two, it should serve to remind you of what's in that little thing, that you have the Word of God. But again, even that you can forget. So again, I think the point here is that when you go out, when you come in, you're supposed to remember the Lord your God. All right, now how about this one? To write a Sefer Torah, that's the book of the law. All right, well, that's awesome. That's what the king was supposed to do. Of course, we don't have kings today, but we now have the Bible in print in just about every language. So that's actually a good thing. We're actually doing this one already. And then, of course, the king's supposed to have his own. You have the tzitzit on four-cornered garments. Now, there's some discussion about this. Are you supposed to actually wear something on any of your clothing, or is it something that's designed for garments that have four corners, such as a prayer shawl? Okay, there is some debate about that. I have to admit that there is some debate about this one. All right, so we have one. There's some debate about it, and we can of course discuss that. But the point here of the tzitzit, what was God giving this for? So that you won't forget him. All right, he says, tell the Israelis that they are to make tassels at the edge of their garments throughout their generations, and they're to put a violet cord of the tassels at the edges of their garments, so as not to forget the Lord their God. He says, and you shall have the tassel, that you may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and that you may not follow the harlotry to which your own heart and your own eyes are inclined. And you may remember and do all my commandments and be holy, for I am your God. Now, sort of the modern version of that is the bracelet that says WWJD. What would Jesus do? Right? So people, they put these on. It's a bracelet, WWJD. Hey, that's to remind me, what would Jesus do? Well, this was God's original version of that. Is, you put this thing on your clothing, and it's saying, hey, what would God do? What would God have me do? What does God want me to do? What did God instruct me to do? All right, so that's the point. That is the point. Now, next one, 86, to circumcise all males on the 8th day after their birth. Well, Americans have basically done this, not on the 8th day like God suggested. Now, was this something that we have to do? Well, think about it, guys. If you're not circumcised, does that mean that God doesn't love you? Well, I don't know. I mean, he does say, let's take it to the New Testament. What did Jesus say? What did the disciples tell us? To be baptized, right? Now, if you're not baptized, does that mean that you're not saved? Well, probably not. But God did say to get baptized, right? So therefore, that means that we should get baptized. Does that mean that we have to be saved? Well, again, I'm not suggesting that. But what the word does tell us is that we should be baptized. And the same thing is true, is that the word tells us that we should be circumcised if we are part of that Abrahamic covenant, which I believe that we are when we take on the yoke of Jesus. All right. Now here's one that seems to bother everybody, and this one is so easy. It says to rest on the 7th day. Well, my goodness, that's just a day off. What's so hard about that? Taking a day off. Don't we just pine for the weekend? We're talking about, oh, I wish it were Friday already, so I'd have the weekend and I could do something. Everybody's looking forward to Friday night. There's even a restaurant, TGIF, right? Thank goodness it's Friday. And yet, when God says, I want you to take Friday from, Friday night to Saturday night off, I want that to be a special day. It's a bonus day. I want you to chill out. I want you guys to get together, talk about me, encourage each other, etc. Suddenly people are like, well, I can't do that. That would be legalism. All God is trying to tell you to do is to take a day off. That's all he's telling you to do. And he says, and you're not to do prohibited labor on the 7th day. So again, imagine that you have a boss. He says, look, Doug, I want to bless you. I want to give you, an extra day off every week. Okay, but here's my only stipulation. I don't ever want to see you in the office on that special day. I want you to hang out, be with your family, and be a blessing to people. Go out and, feed the hungry or something. Okay, well, okay, boss. And, months go by, it's all good. And then little by little, you start to slip back into the office. And he says, listen, what are you doing? I heard you were at the office the other day. That's your day off. That's the day I'm paying you to not come to work. What are you doing? Well, I had a lot of work, boss. And of course, I don't want to get behind. And of course, I care about the company. He says, look, it's my company. I told you to take the day off. Okay. That's the same thing here, is that God is the one who's telling us, take a day off. It's good for you. You need it. I gave it to you. I made this day just for you. It's a blessing. So the point here is to take a day off. And yet again, unfortunately, many Christians think that this day has been done away with, and yet this is the day that God created from day 7. He did not do away with this day. It is still a binding day. It's still a good day. It's still a day of blessing. And we should follow it because that's what Jesus did. That's what all the disciples did. That's what all the prophets did. And of course, that's what God designed in the first place. Okay. And it says the court must not inflict punishment on the Sabbath. Okay, that's great. Take a day off, right? Even the judges get a day off. Your sentencing can wait till tomorrow. Not a problem. All right, this is an interesting one. Not to walk more than 2,000 cubits outside the city boundary of Shabbat. Now, where does it actually say that? Does it say that in the text? Well, what does it say? Does you see that the Lord has given you the Sabbath, and on the sixth day, he gives you food for 2 days. Let each person stay where he is. Let no one leave his place on the seventh day. Well, again, when you actually go and look at that text, what's happening here? What's happening is that this, now keep in mind, this was before God gave the Torah, he gave the law at Mount Sinai. Okay, they're still in the wilderness, they're still on their way to Mount Sinai. He's not given the decree, they've not entered into a covenant yet. And God says, now, God has given them, we'll go back here a little bit. It says, tomorrow, this is verse 23, 16:23. Then he said to them, this is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning. So they laid it up until morning as Moses commanded. It did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. And Moses said, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will be none. Okay, so he's talking about going out and gathering manna, or in other words, work. Okay, he's saying, look, you got 6 days to work, or 6 days to gather your food, which of course God was raining down from heaven. All right, and so he's saying, look, don't work. Don't work. Don't go out and work on that seventh day. You got 6 days to do that, and then you'll have double on that sixth day. God will give you double, so don't do it, and it's not going to spoil. And then it says, now it happened that some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? Now remember, this is before the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Well, how can that be? How can it be that God has not yet given the commandments and the Torah at Sinai, and yet they're already breaking these things? Because these are universal. The Sabbath goes all the way back to the very beginning of time. But of course, the Israelites had been in captivity. They'd kind of forgotten. They lost the tradition. And so God is now reminding them. And he's telling them before they even get to Mount Sinai to keep the Sabbath. But the whole point here is not that you have to sit on your hands in your tent on the Sabbath day. That's not what he's saying. In fact, somebody just asked me this today, and I had a feeling the person was trying to challenge me to show that there's some kind of conflict in keeping this whole law thing. But I believe the conflict is not understanding what God's actually saying. And I think it's very, very simple that he's saying, look, you got 6 days to work. In this case, go out and gather your food. And the sixth day, you're going to gather twice as much bread, and it's not going to spoil. You're going to have plenty. So that the seventh day is, don't go out of your house to gather food. In other words, don't go out of your house to work. But as far as going out and actually enjoying your day, he's not saying you got to sit in your house and just sit on your bed all day and you can, just sit there and don't move until the day is over. He's not saying that. And yet that is how so many people interpret that verse. It's in my opinion, it's very sad. Very sad that they're trying, or maybe they just unintentionally are pitting the covenant that God made with the children of Israel at Mount Sinai and the new covenant. Now, if you haven't checked out my video where I talk about the old covenant versus the new covenant, or God's divorce and remarriage, I'd encourage you to check that out. It is on YouTube. So you can just go put in God's divorce and remarriage, put in Doug Hamp or whatever, and it will come up and you can watch it. It is crucial that you understand what is actually going on there, because that's going to help you understand that the two covenants are not about the do's and don'ts, or they had all these things that they had to do back then, these laws that they had to do, and now we've been freed from all those laws. That's a complete lie. That's a lie from hell. That what has actually happened is God has given us good things to do, and because Israel didn't do them, and yet she was in a betrothal or marriage covenant with God, she was completely betrothed with me. She was married, but not yet cohabiting. But she was married, and she broke that. And so the only way to end that breach of contract was for that contract to die. And the only way for the contract to die was for the husband to die. And the only way for God to die was for him to come in the flesh, to go to the cross, die, and then rise again. And so now we can have a new marriage covenant. It's really quite simple, but it's one of those things that's kind of been hidden from our eyes for a while. But it's right there in the text. All right, let's jump back in. Now, again, I know that this may be too much. That's fine. Come back and get this later. But it's very important that we go through this, that you understand what the text actually says. Because again, people make all kinds of assumptions about what it says, and if they have no idea what it actually says. All right, so number 91, to sanctify the day, that is to set it apart with kiddush and havdalah. In other words, according to the Jewish tradition, you're supposed to set apart the day on Friday evening by lighting candles, and then you're supposed to have a little ceremony after the day. In other words, really what the commandment says is you're just supposed to set it apart. That is what it says. Remember to keep the Sabbath day holy. All right. So it doesn't actually say have a kiddush and a havdalah. Kiddush means to set apart. Havdalah means a separation. The text doesn't actually say that. It just says remember and keep it holy. All right. To rest from prohibited labor on Yom Kippur. Well, okay, this all has to do with those things that fall into the Sabbath guidelines that God is giving us. All right. So again, you're not supposed to work. Take the day off. It's a paid vacation. For goodness sake, take the day off, right? I mean, that's the worst of all things is when you actually have a vacation day. You're supposed to be on vacation, and what do? You're answering phone calls for the boss, right? You're on your computer doing your work. I mean, that's absolutely criminal. All right, that's just pathetic, really. And when you have a day off, you should be, it's a vacation day. You've taken vacation time, right? You got your week's vacation, and can you imagine if you had a week's vacation and yet you were doing your work the whole time of vacation, your regular, for pay work? That would be really pathetic. All right. And yet that's what basically God is saying. Don't do your work on these special holidays. I'm trying to give you a holiday and you're trying to work. That's not what you're supposed to do. All right. So we'll keep on going. A lot of these are all about how you're supposed to rest, you're supposed to take the day off. When you come to Passover, you're supposed to do your spring cleaning. I think that's awesome. Clean out your cupboards. You're going to survive not eating yeast for 8 days. Really, you can do it. It's fun. Enjoy it. It's a party. We have a great time. It's not burdensome at all. It's a blast. It's a lot of fun. The kids love it, and it makes you enjoy, really appreciate bread so much more, okay? But these are things God says to do. And if you'll actually do these, you'll begin to see elements of the scripture that start to pop out at you. You say, oh, I know why Jesus did that. I get it. I see the symbolism. I see the types. I see the pictures. But until you actually practice these things, you're not going to get it. Now, chametz is essentially any kind of yeast that is in your house. So you're supposed to get rid of all that. And it's a beautiful picture that God wants you to do. You're supposed to relate the Exodus from Egypt that night. Yes, that's a great thing to go through. Jesus did it. Why don't we do it? Of course we should. To hear the shofar on the first day of Tishrei, that is the Feast of Trumpets. Some people call it Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year. There's some debate whether it's actually the beginning of the year, but nevertheless, you should blow the shofar, have a party. All right, that's all you're supposed to do. If you really look at this list carefully, God is commanding you to have a party, and then have another party, and then have a vacation, and have another party. I mean, if you actually practice all these things, you're like, my goodness, we have a lot of days off. It's pretty awesome, and each one has its tradition that goes with it. Now, look, these are not Jewish holidays. These are God's holidays. Sure, there's a bit of Jewish spice in the whole thing because obviously they have been celebrating these things, and so we can appreciate some of their tradition. But the holidays themselves come from God. God is the one who wants us to keep these. He told us to do these things. All right. He told us. Now, again, as you're going through this list, you can say, well, did God actually say that? And if he did, great. If he didn't, then don't worry about their tradition unless you perhaps want to do that. Okay. Now, let's keep going. We're talking about Sukkot. That's when you get together. That is going to be, there's so much imagery, symbolism there. It's incredible. If you're interested, take a look at the fall feasts. prophetically fulfilled. That is a video that I did. I call it the Fall Feast and the Return of Jesus. So you can check that out on YouTube as well. Each man is to give a half shekel annually. Well, of course, we can't really do that because we don't have a temple. So that's something, again, it's not abolished. It's not abolished. It's just inoperative. All right. It's just inoperative. All right. The courts must calculate to determine when a new month begins. Well, is the calendar fixed? Well, it could be. I mean, we could just go with what we have now with NASA. That's real possible. So either way, to afflict and cry out before God in times of catastrophe. Well, we already do that, right? Something bad happens. What do? You cry out to God. And God just tells you to do that. Okay, no problem. To marry a man by means prescribed in the Torah, the Kiddushin, you're supposed to have what God is telling you to do. And then, of course, Deuteronomy 24, you cannot remarry your wife if she married somebody after you. So let's say you guys get married and it doesn't work out, you get divorced. She marries another guy, they get divorced. Sorry, she can't come back and be your wife. It just doesn't work that way. It's not what God has prescribed. He says that would be an abomination and that would pollute the land. So don't do it. God must know what he's talking about. Not to have relations with women, thus not married. Well, that's still a good commandment. Not to withhold food, clothing, and relations from your wife. Well, okay, that's a good commandment. To have children with one's wife. Well, that's a great commandment, right? Be fruitful, multiply. That's what God said to do. Now, God says to issue divorce by means of a get document. All right. Now, what does it actually say? In Deuteronomy 24:1, it says, if a man chooses to enter into marriage with a woman, but she finds herself displeasing to him because he has found something objectionable about her. Now, the actual Hebrew says, ervat davar, which is some kind of a impurity, some kind of a sexual impurity. He must draw up divorce papers, hand them to her, and then send her out of his house. Now, this is actually for the woman's protection, believe it or not, because what could happen is that the man could send her away, but she's still legally married. So now she's really in no man's land because she cannot marry somebody else because she's still legally married to the first guy. But she's now been kicked out of the house, so she has nowhere to live, right? And there's no battered women's shelter down the street. There's nowhere to go. She can only go back home to dad. But then dad can't, get her another husband because she's still married to the first guy. So this is actually protecting the woman so that if for some reason that the husband doesn't want her, he is supposed to first give her a divorce certificate and then send her away. And to some extent, this has been abused by the rabbinical system where you can get a civil divorce, and yet for whatever reason, the man, and backed up by the rabbis, may not give you a religious divorce. And that is not what the commandment is all about. All right, so again, these are different things that we're supposed to do here. Now, here's one. Again, they say, well, wait a second, Doug. Well, again, to do Yubim, marry childless brother's widow. First of all, this was at the widow's discretion. She did not have to marry her husband's brother. Okay, but in order to carry on that line, that was a real possibility. And keep in mind, if you were a woman and you didn't have any children, there was no Social Security. There was nothing outside of your children that would take care of you. So if you don't have any children, this is an incredible blow. So the only time that the husband's brother was supposed to marry her is if she did not have any children. But of course, it was at the widow's discretion. She was not forced into doing this, but this is how she could carry on the line, and then she could have children. All right, so to do chalitza, to freeing a woman from Yubim, so there's always the possibility. The widow must not remarry until the ties with her brother-in-law are removed. So again, if she's not going to take that option to have children with her husband's brother, then then they have to remove that legal issue there. So again, it's not some oppressive system that God gave. It's always for protection. It's always for the good of the people. It's the love your neighbor kind of laws. These are all love your neighbor kind of laws. All right. The court must find one who seduces a maiden. Okay. So if you now again, not rape, but seduction, then he is to be fined. Now the rapist must marry the maiden if she chooses. Now again, is probably not violent rape, but seduction. All right. So the big picture is that there's no rape and run. That's really important to understand. Okay, that did not happen. If that were to happen, then it was life or the cost of your life. Okay. So in other words, if you just tried to violate somebody, that was it just for like what we have today to some extent. You violate somebody, and then sometimes they murder them, unfortunately. uh, that is a real problem. That was, of course, a problem back then as well, not like it is today. But if that did happen, then it would be life for life. All right. So think about this: if you are going to seduce a maiden and have relations with her, again, presumably that there's some kind of some chemistry that going on here. You guys just got married, okay? You can't get divorced at this point because you skipped the ceremony, you skipped the betrothal where you first get her hand in marriage and you pledge yourself to her and she pledges herself to you and your parents bless it and all that stuff, and you just go straight for the cohabitation. Well, now you're divorced and there's no recourse. Now you're divorced forever. So this isn't some terrible thing that God's like, okay, that I don't care about women and this is just going to be terrible and it's going to be terrible for women's rights. That's not what he's saying. It's for protection, you guys. You have to understand this. All right, so this, and then again, and then if a man marries a woman, then he slanders her, says, "Oh, I don't think she's really that pure." Well, wait a second. You know, you, if it's proven that she is pure, then you can't divorce her. So again, you really got to think before you go into marriage, just like you do today, right? So you really got to think about these things, right? You not to put oil on your meal offering, not put frankincense on the meal offering. Okay, interesting. Not to have sexual relations with your mother. Well, I'm still I'm in favor of this law. Not to have sexual relations with your father's wife. I'm still in favor of that law. And all these laws about who you can't have sex with. These are still good laws. Very good laws. And if we practice these, if we practiced the prohibition of these laws, then we would have a lot fewer troubles here in America. And so this whole thing is about who you're not supposed to have relations with, or what you're not supposed to have relations with. Okay, you're not supposed to have relations with animals, for example. And guess what? Yeah, homosexuals. That kind of relationship is forbidden. Okay, it's one of many, but it is forbidden. It's absolutely forbidden. But notice here, a woman, a man must not have sexual relations with a beast. That makes pretty good sense, okay? And yet it happened, and it's happening today. But God said no, and a woman must not do that. It happened back then. It's happening today. God said no. Homosexuality, God said no. Okay, it's not the worst of all sins, but it is a sin that God said no way. Do not do that. Okay, so here we have this whole thing going on here. Now, here's one that guys said, well, wait a second, what about this law? Not to have sexual relations with a menstrually impure woman. Well, frankly, and again, not to, get gross or anything, but, she's bleeding, okay? It's not exactly pleasant when there's blood for anybody. So, again, think about it. Instead of being selfish, think about who this is for. It's really to protect the woman, okay? Not to marry non-Jews. Well, again, here's one I think that the rabbis have kind of uh, they've missed this one, in my opinion. So I believe they misinterpret it, because here's what it says. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land which you go to possess, and has cast out nations before you, namely the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you, they are not to marry those particular nations. That is the law. Okay, it doesn't say that a Jew cannot marry a Moabitess, for example. Okay, it doesn't say that. It says these specific nations. In my book, Corrupting the Image, I show that these specific nations were mixed with with fallen angels, and you have the Nephilim. So you can take a look at that, Corrupting the Image, and I talk all about that. I also have videos about that on YouTube, so you can go ahead and check that out. Not to let a Moabite and an Ammonite males marry into the Jewish people. Now again, we know that Boaz married Ruth. So, well, how can that be? Well, it says a Moabite male. In the Hebrew, you have a distinction between masculine and feminine nouns. And so here, you're not to let a Moabite male or Ammonite male to marry into the Jewish, or in the words, the Israelite people. Let me just say this. Here again, Aish, of course, .com, written by Jews. They're talking about the Jewish nation. But back then, back in the wilderness at Sinai, there was no Jewish nation. That is really a misnomer. All right. And I just put out a Bible buzz about that. Was Abraham Jewish? No, he wasn't. Abraham was not Jewish. Isaac was not Jewish. Jacob was not Jewish. All right, the only Jew that was among them was Judah. All right, he's the only Judahite that there actually was. Now, after the split of the United Kingdom after Solomon, then you have the house of Judah and you have the house of Israel in the north, and then of course we have um, the removal of the nation of Israel, the house of Israel in the north in 722, and then all that's left are the people of Judah. And so they become known as the Jews. And it's certainly after the Babylonian captivity, they are the only show in town. So they're not called the Jewish people. But the Jewish people is not a blanket term for all Israelites. Okay, that would be like saying that all Californians are Americans. That's true, but not all Americans are Californians. That is not true. All right, say that in some bar in Texas and see what you get. It's not going to work out for you so well. So there's really kind of a misnomer here. It's unfortunate because it leads to a bit of confusion. But if you just understand that, that should help. All right, don't keep a third-generation Egyptian convert from marrying into the Jewish people. Well, again, this is not something that we have to even think about today because those days are long gone. All right, and so on and on the list goes. All right, now it says don't castrate any male. Well, that's a good one. Okay, the high priest must not marry a widow. Well, okay, that's a good law, but it's not going to have any effect on us because, well, we're not back there. Two, there are no high priests today. Now, is this law abolished? No, the law is inoperative. It's simply not something that we can use today, but it's not abolished. The high priest must not have sexual relations with a widow, even outside of marriage. Again, this is not something that has been abolished, but it's inoperative. Anything that has to do with the high priest, the temple, are laws that are now inoperative. Okay, so that's really the point here. Not to make pleasurable sexual contact with any forbidden women. Well, I think that's still a good law, right? Again, we have it from Leviticus 18:6. So anybody that is on the list, you can't have relations with your mother-in-law, etc. That is still, of course, good. Those are good laws. Now, to examine the signs of animals to distinguish between kosher and non-kosher. Well, these are still good laws. If you take a look at Leviticus 11, he tells you what animals you're not supposed to eat. Like you're not supposed to eat dogs, horses, pigs. You're not supposed to eat skunks. You're not supposed to eat rats. Okay, you don't want to eat those things because they're nasty. All right. And it says to examine the signs of fowl to distinguish between kosher and non-kosher. Those are still good laws. And then the fish, right? Things you're not supposed to eat because they're bottom feeders like shrimp and other things. He just says don't eat this stuff, okay? They're great animals, but they're not good for eating, okay? They're just not healthy for you. All right, so again, about all these different animals that you can and cannot eat. Not to benefit from a beast condemned to be stoned. If it's condemned to be stoned because it gored somebody, sorry, just kill the thing and be done with it. Not to eat meat of an animal that was mortally wounded. So don't eat roadkill. Okay, that's a law. Don't eat roadkill. You're not supposed to do that. Not to eat a limb torn off a living creature. Oh my goodness, of course not, right? I mean, that's still a good law. Really, I hope you wouldn't agree or disagree with that law. That's still a good one, right? And that's right from the text. Not to eat blood. God says don't do it. It's even in the New Testament, you guys. Not to eat law. And yet people seem to somehow forget that one. All right. Not to eat certain fats of kosher animals, right? So you just shouldn't. Not to eat the sinew of the thighs. God said don't do that. Now here's one that's purely interpretive. Not to eat meat and milk cooked together. That is not what the text says. What it literally says is that you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Okay, you're not to boil a young goat in its mother's milk. That's all the text actually says. Don't boil a kid or a young goat in its mother's milk. And as I read that, it's just straightforward. All right, don't milk a goat and then take its little baby and kill the baby and then take the milk and then cook it in that milk. That's what it's saying. As whether you can have a cheeseburger, I don't think that has any relation to what that is saying. All right, but of course, the way that they've listed it here is you should not cook meat and milk together, but that's not what the text actually says. Okay. Now there's a bunch of other ones that we have about what you can eat, what you're not supposed to eat, and I think that they get most of these right as far as I can tell. I'm going a little bit quickly just so that we can get through a lot of these, but these are still good laws. Okay, a lot of these have to do with very practical, pragmatic issues about how to treat the land. How to treat the land. Not to drink wine poured in service to idols. Well, okay, I think that makes good sense, right? You're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to engage in any kind of idolatry. To ritually slaughter an animal before eating. Now, the word ritually is not actually in the text. It just says that you're supposed to slaughter it. You're supposed to slaughter an animal before eating it. Well, that makes good sense, right? You're supposed to kill the thing before you start eating the thing. Right? What does God actually say? If the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish his name is distant from you, then you may slaughter from your herd and your flock what the Lord has provided for you as he has instructed you. You may consume them in your cities as much as you please. When you actually take a look at the text, it makes perfect sense. Okay, so, and again, keep in mind that slaughtering an animal, we do that all the time today, and that's how we get our cheeseburgers and our Big Macs and all that stuff, right? It's because we're slaughtering animals, and God is actually concerned about how you slaughter an animal. It says not to slaughter an animal and its offspring on the same day. So you don't kill mommy and baby on the same day. All right, you just don't do that. Why? Well, I don't know. I mean, God hasn't exactly told us why. You just don't do it. And if it's important to God, then it should be important to us. And this is still a good law. There's nothing wrong with that law. It's a great law. And God gave it. These must be good laws, right? To cover the blood of a beast or fowl with earth. Well, again, that makes sense. You don't want blood to be out there. Think about it. If you leave blood out just on the dirt, what happens? Bugs come, they get the blood, they carry disease, they take it, they spread it. This is basic hygiene. This is 101, you guys. This is hygiene 101. Not to take the mother bird with her children. Okay, don't do that. To release the mother bird before taking her children. Okay. Not to swear in falsely not God's name. I'm for that. Again, don't take his name in vain, all these different things, right? Not to deny possession of something entrusted to you. Your neighbor says, hey, can you hold this for me? Yeah, sure, of course I'll do it. And then he comes back, hey, can I have my thing back? Oh, no, you can't. Well, that doesn't make any sense, right? We're still for all these laws. Not to swear falsely in denial of a monetary claim. Again, you're supposed to be honest. You're supposed to have integrity. You're supposed to do the right thing. We agree with that. Okay. Now it says to swear in God's name to confirm the truth when deemed necessary by court. So if you actually look at the Hebrew version of Matthew, it actually says that yes, you are to swear an oath. Okay. So it seems that there's been some kind of a translation issue that we have that where we read it. Jesus says don't swear an oath. Okay. But actually, if you read the Matthean version in Hebrew, then it actually says that yes, you actually should swear an oath, and you're supposed to do that. Okay, because again, Jesus is not going to disagree one iota with what his Father actually said. And we're supposed to fulfill what was uttered and to do what was avowed. We call that a contract, right? Not to break oaths or vows. Again, keep your contracts. Let a yes be yes, and your no be no. Just do the right thing. You shouldn't even have to swear. You just do it, right? For oaths and vows annulled, these are the laws of annulling vows explicit in the Torah, etc. All right, the Nazir must let his hair grow, and then he's supposed to cut it after he's out of his vow. Now, the Nazir is essentially Samson, right? He's been set apart, and he is to, these are the different things he's supposed to do. Now, that's just something that's not exactly practical or possible for us to do. But he's not supposed to eat grapes of any sort, right? He can't be in the same roof as a corpse. And then he must shave after bringing sacrifices upon completion of his Nazirite period. Well, of course, Samson didn't quite do that one correctly, did he? But the whole point here is that this is something that's still good. There's nothing wrong with this. Paul actually did this. He paid for those 4 men to take the Nazirite vow after the cross, mind you. And so this is still in operation. All right. It may not be very practical for us today. That's possible. But again, it's not been abolished. It may be somewhat inoperative or impractical, but it's not been abolished. None of these have been abolished. Some of them are inoperative. They're dormant. You can't even just do it. the vast majority of these are good, obviously, except the ones where it deals with the temple. To estimate the value of people when someone pledges a person's worth as determined by the Torah, to estimate the value of consecrated animals, to estimate the value of consecrated houses, etc. So again, all of these are still very good. You're supposed to carry out the laws of interdicting possessions. Okay, so again, things that have been set aside, you have laws for that. Not to sell the cherem, the thing that has been set apart. Not to redeem the cherem, again, things set apart. Not to plant diverse seeds together. What does he say? You should not let your livestock breed with another kind. That makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, again, cows shouldn't mix with horses, right? That just makes good sense. You shall not sow your field with mixed seed, nor shall the garment of mixed linen and wool come upon you. Very important to understand. People say, well, you can't wear clothing of mixed materials. No, that's not what it says. It says you cannot have it mixed with linen and wool, right? Those two specific things are what you're not supposed to do. It doesn't say, it's not a general, but it's those two specific materials you're not supposed to mix, all right? But as far as sowing your field with mixed seed, you're not supposed to do that. And there are reasons, because there are a lot of plants that don't work well with one another. And so then it's spoiled. So again, God is looking out for us. He's giving us great instructions on how to live. And I'll tell you what, we're going to pay the price if we violate these things. It doesn't mean that God's going to strike us all dead someday. It means that we are going to pay the price very practically, right? And we're going to, it may be that we have a poor crop. Maybe that we have food that's contaminated. Maybe that we have things like GMO on the rise, because we think that's the only way we can eat, and yet we know that GMO is very dangerous for us. Not to plant grains or greens in a vineyard, right? Not to crossbreed animals, not to work different animals together, right? Of course, we know this, right? You should not yoke two different kinds of animals. All right, here it says not to wear shatnez, a cloth woven of wool and linen. Again, this refers specifically to wool and linen, not different materials in general, but those two specific. All right, to leave a corner of the field uncut for the poor. Okay, now look, I'm not a farmer. I don't own any fields. I'm not out there doing this. So what is the spirit of this law? Well, to provide, to help the poor, not just dole out money for him. Here's $10, right? No, you can do that sometimes, but this has much more dignity. What this is saying is leave something for the poor, and he can come and he can work. He can work. There's dignity in work. There's not much dignity in a handout. Sometimes we all need a handout, but most of the time we should be able to work one way or the other. And so what God is doing is he's saying, look, I'm providing a way for the poor to still have some dignity. He can go and he can actually earn his food. He can earn his paycheck, if you will. So don't reap the corner, to leave gleanings for the poor. Again, God is looking out for the poor. These are all about the poor. He has so many laws for the poor. Now, these next ones that I've grayed out, these are all about the Cohen, the high priest. These are things that the high priest is to do or not do. All right, now, there's also going to be a second tithe. Okay, it's supposed to be eaten in Jerusalem. But the second tithe is something that you are actually supposed to do for yourself. In other words, God is saying, put aside 10%. Set aside 10%. What are the great financial planners of our day tell us, and people that are telling us how to get out of debt and how to save for tomorrow? They say, you know what? You need to pay yourself 10%. Just do it. They say that. All right. And that's what people are saying today. And well, guess what? God already said that. And then he says, go on vacation, take that money and spend it however you want to do it. Okay. Do whatever you want. That's what God is saying to do. If you really look at this stuff, it becomes simply incredible. Now, again, you have some different tithes that were in relation to the temple, in relation to Jerusalem specifically. So some of those things we may or not be able to do. Again, set aside the first fruits and bring them to the temple. We can't specifically do that, but there's certainly the spirit of the law, since we can't actually go to a temple because there isn't one. So that's inoperative. It's inoperative in that sense, but it's not been abolished. So we can still set aside our first fruits and take them somewhere, right? We could take them to God in one form or another, all right? It doesn't have to be actually things that we pick from the ground. It could be money that we get from a paycheck, and we can take it possibly to the church. That's a possibility. Or you could take it to your favorite charity or whatever. But, use that money for God. Again, things referring to the Kohanim, etc. In some ways, you're supposed to bake and not bake, and reference to that. To rest the land during the 7th year by not doing any work which enhances growth. Again, every farmer knows that it's good to let your land lay fallow every 7 years. This is something that's still known today. And a lot of times they don't do it because of greed, basically, but that's what God says to do. Right? These are still very productive kind of laws. Then he talks about loans. Now imagine, just a couple years ago, back in 2007 and 8, we had an absolute meltdown, right? And basically, that time came. It's also called the Shemitah, where loans or debts are released. One way or another, it's going to happen. If we do it voluntarily, then we can benefit from it. If it has to be forced upon us, then it's going to come rather painfully. And so these are all the different things that we have. Now, I have not gone through the whole list just because we're running out of time, but there's so many different things. A lot of these I've grayed out for us because these are things specifically for the temple. And so there may still be a principle, there may still be an application to some extent, but they're not specifically, the Kohanim must wear their priestly garments during service. Well, okay, again, I'm not a Cohen, I'm not a priest. We don't have a temple. So this is something that's now inoperative. There will be a temple in the future. There will be a temple in the future. So these laws are simply inoperative because they're still going to be used in the age to come. If you don't believe that, go ahead and look at Ezekiel 40 through 48, and you'll see that the temple service is very much in operation in that day. So a lot of these laws are not applicable today. They're not possible to do today because we don't have the temple system. Okay, here's one. Remove the ashes from the altar every day. That's very, very practical. Okay, that just makes good sense, right? All right, so you got to count the Omer, 7 weeks from the day the new wheat offering was brought. We can still do that, but we can't do some of the things that were done actually in the temple. But we can still have a barbecue because remember, when you slaughter an animal, they would eat it. Okay, so you can still have the barbecue. That's pretty awesome. Okay, not to eat from sacrifices which became impure. Right. So basically, you've got meat. It's been in the fridge now for about a week and a half. It's looking kind of nasty. You don't want to eat that stuff. All right. Now they didn't have refrigeration back then, so they had basically 3 days that God said, okay, if it still hasn't been eaten on the 3rd day, you're not supposed to eat it. It had to be thrown away. You said to get rid of it, burn the leftover sacrifices, right? And that's what was actually happening back then. So again, law after law after law, we see, many of these are inoperable today, right? They're inoperable, they're dormant because we don't have a temple system. Now, the ones that really that in our case, for today, Jesus did so many of these things that we can now just look to him. But in the future, these will be operable once again under the when the Levites are once again working in the temple, in that millennial temple. Okay, not to take the paschal meat from the confines of its group. All right, again, these are some of the things we have to take a look at. What exactly are they trying to talk about? What are they saying here? Well, it says the lamb is to be eaten in one house, and you're not to take any of its meat outside the house, nor are you to break any of its bones. Well, again, that's maybe not exactly what they say, but that's pretty close. An apostate must not eat from it. So if you don't believe, you're not supposed to eat that. Okay, so yeah, that's still true. Wouldn't we say that, look, if you don't really believe in Jesus, you shouldn't take the communion? That's what the average church person says, right? So that's the principle. That's basically the principle. There's maybe more to that, but that's the basic principle. Okay, and so again, you're not supposed to break any of its bones. That was all done in Yeshua. We, of course, know that, but these things are still good laws. To be seen at the temple on Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Well, again, because we don't have a temple, these are now inoperable. That's the key word there, inoperable. All right. To celebrate on these 3 feasts by bringing an offering, well, we can't take an offering to the temple. We can still have a barbecue. Remember, the animal that they sacrificed, they ate as well. to rejoice on these 3 festivals. Well, this shouldn't even be grayed out, right? We're actually supposed to do that. Let's put that one in. Let's put that one actually in green, because we're supposed to rejoice. You see, this is what these things are all about. It's about a rejoicing. There's a form and a function to some of these things, but you're supposed to rejoice. Here's another one: not to refrain from rejoicing and giving gifts. All right. So all of these are really fun. These are very just great things to do. Okay, now let's look at some of these other laws. We're getting there here. A woman who had a running issue must bring an offering after she goes to a mikvah. Well, first of all, a mikvah is just a bath. That's all that means. Now, can she actually take an offering to the temple? Well, no, of course she cannot, because there is no temple, but she can still take a bath. We know that, right? So she can still take a bath. At least here in America, I would, dare to say that most of us take a bath maybe every day, every other day, every third day, probably at least once a week. But I think the average American is probably taking a shower every day or every other day. So we're getting a lot of mikvah time, right? We are getting lots of running water, living water poured over us in the form of a shower or a bath. And that's what God is telling us to do. Some of it's just very practical. Hey, you smell, go take a bath. Okay, that's what it is. All right. So a metzorah is a leprous person, according to the Torah, is leprosy. It's a hygienic problem where it is something spiritual or malicious, miraculous, must bring an offering after going to the mikvah. Well, again, we don't have a temple, so to some extent this is inoperative, but there's still a principle here. And again, as you look at some of these different laws, you can really begin to see some things. To carry out the laws of impurity of the dead. Well, we believe in these things, right? If somebody dies, what do we do? Do we just leave the body in the house? No, of course not, because it starts to putrefy, starts to bloat, smell, right? Disease can happen, bugs start to come. I'm sorry to gross you out, but this is what God's trying to tell you. When somebody dies, you have to deal with the body. You've got to bury the body. All right. So God has regulations about how you should do that. Just like today, we have regulations about what we're supposed to do with a dead person. We don't just leave them there. Hey, there's, Aunt Susie. She's been dead now for 3 weeks, but we thought we'd just leave her here because we've been really enjoying having her. No, it doesn't work that way. We have to get rid of that dead body. As much as we loved Aunt Susie, we have to get rid of her dead body, because it is just going to cause all kinds of problems. And so that is what is really going on here. And yet again, people are unaware of what is actually going on. Okay, how about some of these? Observe the laws of impurity caused by childbirth. Look, when a woman gives birth to a baby, it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of strength. And to have some time off, where she's set apart for a couple weeks, well, that's what a mother wants. She actually wants that maternity leave so that she can be with her baby. And God actually gives the woman more time in case of a girl than a boy. Why exactly? I'm not so sure. But basically, she's to be set apart for her time because, yeah, she actually has blood flowing. It's not a very nice thing. It's kind of yucky, right? So let her alone. Just don't bother her. Let her be by herself and maybe her husband, okay? But it doesn't mean that she's a bad person. It just means that, hey, there's blood flowing, and blood can lead to disease, all right? It can lead to impurity. It can lead to, just basically, the cooties, for lack of a better word, all right? And so it can lead to some kind of disease. And so he's giving people good hygienic laws is what God is actually doing. All right. Again, observe the laws of impurity caused by a dead beast. Well, again, when you encounter a dead animal, what are you going to do? I'm going to go home and wash my hands. All right. He says, look, if any one of the animals that you may eat dies, the one who touches its carcass becomes unclean until evening. It doesn't mean you're a bad person or that God doesn't like you or that you're a sinner. It just means that you've got the cooties, you've got germs, right? And you need to be set apart and take a bath because you have that. That's exactly what we would do today. Quarantine that guy. He's got some disease on his hands. He needs to wash his hands, right? That's what God is telling us to do. Go take a bath. Be away from each other, from anybody else for a while, because you've got dirty stuff on your hands. You've got germs on your hands. That's all God is telling you to do. It's really that simple. Here's one. Observe the laws of impurity of a seminal emission. Okay. Well, this is just basic stuff, guys. Again, if that happens, wash your hands. Okay. That's really that simple. It's really, really, really that simple. All right. Every person must immerse himself in a mikvah to become pure. Oh, no, we can't do that. We already do that every day. We take baths. Again, as I said, I take a bath every day, I take a shower every day. I'm guessing that's enough, right? We're getting running water. It's clean water. We're clean. So we're already doing that. Now, the next set of laws have to do with damages. What happens if your next door neighbor's dog does something to you? What do you do in those kind of situations? Or the court must judge the damages incurred by an animal eating something. Or again, damages incurred by falling into a pit or by fire. All right. These are just basic stuff. These are still on our books today. These are the laws that we would actually follow. Not to steal money stealthily, right? I mean, there it is. It's all right there. We already keep these things. We're supposed to have honest scales and weights. Yes, we're supposed to do that. You want that. You want somebody to sell you a pound of sugar, not 3/4 of a pound and say it was a pound. You want a pound of sugar. If you're buying a pound of sugar, you want a pound of sugar. All right? Not to commit injustice with scales and weights. God really hates that. He says it repeatedly that he really hates that. Not to not to move a boundary marker or steal someone's property. Well, again, we still have laws about this, about property lines and what to do in the cases of encroachment. What do you do, right? God has told you there are lines for property and don't move those. That's illegal. Not to kidnap. I'm still thinking that's a good law. Not to rob openly. I'm still thinking that's a good law. Not to withhold wages or fail to repay a debt. Well, that's really significant. That's very significant. Some of our political ramblings we've heard lately have some interesting implications regarding that. But again, these are all things that we already believe. Return the robbed object or its value. Of course, of course, of course. We already do these. Don't murder. Well, that's a no-brainer, right? The court must send the accidental murderer to a city of refuge. Well, we may not be able to send people to a city of refuge, but do we have laws in place that deal with what to do if somebody accidentally murders somebody? Yes, we do. Okay. Is it perfect? I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. Maybe we should set up a city of refuge. I don't know. That's something we could discuss. But again, these are still good laws. It's not like these things were nailed to the cross when Jesus died. That's not what happened. All right. So again, here I've even highlighted, bolded these, not to kill the murderer before he stands trial. Well, of course not. We're not supposed to go out and just, randomly murder people because, hey, you killed my brother, I'm going to kill you now. No, he gets his day in court. All right. Save someone being pursued, even by taking the life of the pursuer. Yeah, you're supposed to defend the person who's a victim. Okay. Not to pity the pursuer. All right. If somebody is pursuing and is trying to kill somebody, well, look, if somebody is trying to get a little kid and going to try to hurt that little kid, well, you're supposed to protect the little kid. All right, that's just an example. But again, think about it. These are real life things. Not to stand idly by if someone's life is in danger. You see somebody's life is in danger, they're about to fall off a cliff, and you just stand there. Oh, I don't care. Well, you become really, you become involved in their accidental death, right? You could have helped the person. You could have given the guy the Heimlich maneuver. You could have given him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. You could have saved him from drowning if you just jumped in the water and gotten him out, right? This is what the law is telling you to do. This is all about loving your neighbor, right? All of these laws are either about loving God or loving your neighbor. That's really what it's all about. Okay, now here's one that's not really practical for us today because we may not live in the land. Break the neck of a calf by a stream following an unsolved murder. But, again, as I see it, and I could be wrong, but as I see it, the whole point was if you find somebody who has been murdered outside your city, the elders of the city are supposed to go and to inquire. They're supposed to inquire carefully and see what actually happened. And then if they say, look, we can't find what happened, we had nothing to do with it, then they're supposed to take a calf and they're supposed to break the calf's neck by a stream, and then they will be absolved from any kind of any kind of guilt. Now, maybe we should still do that. I really don't know. It's something we'd have to think about. But, there's a reason that God said to do that. It wasn't just willy-nilly, random schmandom. There's a reason that he said to do that. Okay, and then neither work nor plant that river valley. Interesting. Again, something to consider, and we could try to understand what God actually had there. Not to allow pitfalls or obstacles to remain on your property. Now look at that. Isn't that just practical? All right. So you've got some property. You've got, there's some big divots there. There's some places that could be dangerous for people. What should you do? Your sidewalk is incredibly broken. It's a real hazard. Should you fix it? Well, God thinks so. God thinks you should. God thinks that you should have your property so that it's safe, so that when people come on, they will not be at risk. Here's one I love, one of my favorites. Make a guardrail around flat roofs. Well, this is just common sense, right? You've got, flat roof. You can go up there and have a party, but you have no guardrail. This is dangerous. You're asking for somebody to fall off. It's incumbent upon you, the property owner, to have something up there to protect people. That's called loving your neighbor. That's it. Loving your neighbor. There's one. Don't put a stumbling block before a blind man. Well, again, that's loving your neighbor. Help another remove the load from a beast which can no longer carry it. That's loving your neighbor, or loving your neighbor's animal. Help others load their beast. Okay, again, this is a helping hand, being a good neighbor. Not to leave others distraught with their burdens, but to help either load or unload. Again, a lot of people do this. They just do it. They do it automatically. They don't have to be told to do this. Well, that's awesome when you just do what the law tells you to do. That's really what God wants us to do. So it's not that these things have been done away with, but really all of these things should now be in your heart. That's where they should be. He shouldn't have to keep telling you and drilling you, do these things. Because you love the Lord, you should just do these things. But if you have questions about, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm not really sure. Well, here's the list so that you can check it out. Look at that. Not to overcharge or underpay. All right. That's being fair. Not to insult or harm anybody with words. Again, this is just being a kind person. Not to cheat a sincere convert monetarily. Again, all these things are very practical. What about this? Purchase a Hebrew slave in accordance with the prescribed laws. Well, again, there were laws about slavery. Okay, and in the case of a Hebrew slave, more often than not, it was actually the slave who was out of money and he had no other recourse, and so he could sell himself. He was still his own master, but he could sell himself into slavery, and then after 6 years, he would go free and he would be given lots and lots of gifts. Okay, you're not supposed to work him oppressively, not allow a non-Israelite really to work him oppressively, and not to have him do a menial slave labor. Okay, now there's something about that, right? So now keep in mind that, and when he says when he leaves, you give him lots of gifts. So one thing to keep in mind is that slavery was because of indebtedness. It was not a permanent status. Even the other slaves, they were there because there were other slaves because they were conquered in war. But there was no slave trade like the 250 years ago here in America or other places. There was no slave trade. There was no, hey, you're a slave because you're this color. But you could be taken in war. Okay, in other words, my nation's fighting your nation, and we win, you lost. Then they would become your slaves. But it was never something where it went on and on and on permanently. Their children could they were not just handed off into slavery. They were not whipped. It was not something like that. They had rights. They were still people. All right, they were still people. And again, in the case of an Israelite slave, you were to send him away with all kinds of gifts, etc. And so those are some of the laws about slavery. Okay. Now the courts must carry out the laws of a hired worker or a hired guard. They got to pay the wages the day that they're earned. They're not to delay payment. Jesus said all these things. A hired worker may eat from the unharvested crops where he works and when he's working. Okay, you should not muzzle an ox while it's plowing. Even Paul said that, right? The courts must carry out the laws of a borrower. All right, these are called banking laws, right? Monetary laws. All this is monetary policy. You're to pay your debts, right? The creditor must not forcibly take collateral. I like that. When you go to collect the money, you're not supposed to go in his house. You're supposed to let The debtor bring out the payment to you. You, the creditor, are to stay outside his house. You're not supposed to go inside his house. Again, it's all about loving your neighbor. And again, these are all good laws. So many good laws. You're to appoint judges. You're not to appoint judges who are familiar with who are not familiar with judicial procedure. You are to decide majority in case of disagreement. And in capital punishment cases, the court must not execute through a majority of one. At least a majority of two is required. All right, so again, there has to be a majority vote of at least two to put somebody to death. And it's not vigilante style. It's that they get their day in court. They get their day in court. And then the way that they were killed was actually quite humane. It was stoning. You say, well, that's not so great. Well, it's actually pretty quick, all right? And it sure beats some of the other methods. Now, there were times, okay, really one of the only times that there was a penalty of death. It says if a man takes a wife along with her mother, that's wickedness. They are to be burned with fire, him and them, so there'll be no wickedness in your midst. Now, God said that, all right? So my suggestion is don't take a wife and her mother as your wife as well, all right? Again, that's just, we'd call that sick and disgusting. God calls it evil, and it's supposed to be, you're supposed to get rid of that. Okay, you're not supposed to do that. There are times to carry out the death penalty by sword, but again, these are all quick. They're all right to the point. Not quite as fast as a bullet, but they didn't have bullets back then. But still, you'd be gone pretty quick. Then they were to stone some people they were to hang people that were stoned for blasphemy or idolatry. And then they were to bury the executed on the day that they're killed. They're not supposed to leave them there. All right. Again, they're not supposed to let the sorcerer live. They're supposed to get rid of the sorceress. Again, don't be a sorcerer. God is very, very much against it. So there are reasons that he says to get rid of these people, because it leads to all kinds of debauchery, and just it leads to slavery and bondage. See, it's not keeping the law that leads to bondage. It's breaking the law that leads to bondage. Look, the court must not kill anybody on circumstantial evidence. All right, so you cannot be you cannot be sentenced to death if there's only circumstantial evidence. There has to be absolute hardcore evidence, right? Just like we would expect in our court of law. This is what God is saying. So you already believe in most of these laws. All right, we're almost there. Just a few more minutes. The court must not punish anybody who was forced to do a crime. So if you're forced to do it, the courts can't punish you. A judge must not pity the murderer or assaulter at the trial. All right, so look, it's clear. Somebody murdered somebody. All the testimony is in. There's no question about it. Okay, sorry. Look, you broke the law. So the penalty for that is death. Okay, and that's what God prescribes. I think we should do that because we have so many people that are locked up in prison, and but again, if they've been truly convicted of it beyond the shadow of a doubt, then yes, they should be taken out of this world. All right, they can repent and get right with God on their way to the gallows or whatever they're going to do. Somehow that pressure of meeting your Maker imminently gets you very much into that place of getting right with God. A judge is not to be partial. He's not to have mercy on the poor man just because he's poor. Right? If he broke the law, he broke the law. A judge must not respect the great man at the trial just because he's rich. Don't say, well, he's rich, I shouldn't do anything. No, you're supposed to be impartial. A judge must not decide unjustly the case of the habitual transgressor. Right? Look, you broke this once, you broke it again, you broke it again. We've got some issues here. Right? So all these are about how to judge people. These are all still very good laws. We still keep these laws. Look at relatives of the litigants must not testify because there's a conflict of interest. No, my son is the best person in the world. He would never do that. Well, maybe we should get somebody else as a testimony, as a witness, because you seem to be biased. Okay? Not to testify falsely. You're going to punish the false witness with the same punishment they were seeking for the defendant. This is what happened in John chapter 8, where the woman caught in adultery, and he says, okay, where are your accusers, woman? And she says, they're gone, Lord. Well, what happened? They knew that if they were found out, the punishment they were trying to give her, stoning, was going to happen to them, because eventually they would be found out because they had no witness. They were not doing it according to God's prescription of how they're supposed to do this. Because if there's a woman caught in the act, there's a man caught in the act. And of course, the man wasn't there. And so obviously the whole thing was a setup. So again, I have an article on that. You can read that on my website about the woman caught in adultery. That's at douglashamp.com. All right, so you're not to add or take away to the commandments. You're not to diminish any of the commandments in whole or in part. You're not to curse your father and mother. That's a good one. You're not to strike your father and mother. That's a good law. You're to respect your father and your mother. You're to fear your father and your mother. These are good. You're not to be rebellious. You are to mourn for relatives. That's a commandment. Well, my goodness, you don't really need to be told to do that, right? But maybe some people do because they don't seem to have any pity or any grief. Yeah, you should mourn for your relatives. Actually, this is probably a really good commandment because some people, they put on that stiff upper lip. How are you doing, Joe? I know you lost, Julie. Oh, man, I'm doing all right, fine. No, the Bible says you are to mourn. You're supposed to let it out for 7 days. You are supposed to cry your heart out. You're supposed to bawl your eyes out. That's what you're supposed to do. Right? It's healthy. It's good for you. It's good for you. You're not supposed to just hold it on and say, I'm fine. That's okay. I'm fine. Okay. Now think about, here's some laws. Destroy the 7 Canaanite nations. Yeah, because they were Nephilim, right? Don't let anybody live. No, because they were Nephilim. Get rid of them. Wipe out the descendants of Amalek. Yeah, because they were completely against what God's people there. And so, but again, this is something we cannot do today, right? These are completely inoperative. There's no way to go back and to redo this situation. It's impossible. All right. Now, if you're sieging a city, don't destroy the fruit trees. You should leave those. Right. Here's a good one. Prepare latrines outside the army camps. Yeah, right. This makes sense, right? Don't let all the stuff, don't let all the excrement just sit around in the camp because it's going to lead to disease and eventually sickness and death. Prepare a shovel for each soldier to dig with. Okay. Again, bury your excrement. All right, here's one. He who's taken a wife, built a new home, or planted a vineyard is given a year to rejoice with his possessions. Wow, that's a nice law. I like that one, Lord. That's a great one. So if you just get married, you got a year to chill. You don't have to do anything. Not to demand from the above any involvement, communal or military. Okay, not to panic or retreat during battle. Be strong, be vigilant, be strong, be courageous. All right, keep the laws with the captive women. Again, this is probably not happening today. But to be kind to her, you're not supposed to abuse her. You're not supposed to sell her into slavery. And not to retain her for servitude after having relations with her. So you've used her, and now you want to get rid of her. No, it doesn't work that way. If you're going to have relations, now she's yours, okay? Or you get to set her free, all right? But again, that's something that's quite impractical for our day. So again, we've gone through the list. It was a long list. This was a longer show. But I really believe that this is important for us to understand what those laws are all about. Because most people have never, ever gone through the list, and they think that it's some gigantic, impossible list. But guess what? You're already keeping most of those laws. A lot of them have to do with money. They have to do with land. They have to do with personal hygiene, right? These are all things that we want to do anyway. And it's about loving God and loving your neighbor. So all of those are about love. The entire list. Now again, it doesn't be 613. Some of them are repetitive. So we don't have to worry about 613. But in light of the millions of laws that we have here in America, I mean, even if it were 613, that's not very many. So be encouraged. The law is good. Those were not nailed to the cross. That is a lie. That's just a lie. What was nailed to the cross was the divorce certificate that God issued that was against us. That was the handwriting that was against us. That was nailed to the cross. Again, you can check out my video, God's Divorce Remarriage, or the Old Testament versus the New Testament, or the Old Covenant versus the New Covenant. So I explain that in that video. It's also on my website, douglashamp.com. You can check out that paper, God's Divorce Remarriage. It's a short paper, and it will really help you to understand what is going on. We've been lied to in large part, starting probably with a guy named Marcion around 140 AD, 144, who came up with this idea that the Old Testament's for the Jews. That's all done and over with, and pretty much the Gospels are really aren't for us either. It's just the writings of Paul, right? And so now Paul's been twisted to say things that he wasn't saying. So God bless you. Be encouraged. Check out that list. Meditate on it a bit. You'll see that it's really not that hard, and they're all about loving each other. They're all about loving each other and loving God. Until next time, I want to encourage you to stay in the Word, because that's where the truth is found. God bless.